Right. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Jill, for that introduction. Thank you all for coming. It's great to be the final speaker for the Tuesday Tea this year. If I say I feel like Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock, I know half of you will understand what I'm talking about. So, thank you for coming. I'm also going to preemptively thank you because this is going to be a little bit of an interactive event today. I'm going to depend on some of your responses at a couple of points. So please feel free when we get there. So the talk today, called Only Cogs and Wheels, Chinese Socialist Realist Art in the AMAM, it is referencing works that are currently on view in the show, Riding the Strong Currents, that you'll mention. And I pulled out, just one section to talk about today. But the term cogs and wheels, what does that come from? Is anybody reading my labels that I work so hard on? Anybody? Yes. Well, one person, Andrea Durstein, knows what cogs and wheels is all about. We'll get to that. We'll return to it. We're going to start with the question: what is the purpose of art? What is art? This is the interactive part. Anybody? And I'll repeat it into the microphone. What is the purpose of art? Why do we do art? To provoke. Awesome. To communicate, to provoke, to inspire, other things, to move people emotionally in the back. A method of communication like language, awesome, good. Other aspects of art you can think of. Sometimes just a release, self-expression, that kind of thing, emotional. Yeah, all of those are great definitions. But let's look at another definition of art. We're looking at Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, leader of the Communist Revolution, and the talks at the Yan'an Forum on Literature and Art from 1942. In it, and there's a photograph at the bottom of Mao and the gang at Yan'an. In it, Mao writes, or said, but it's written down, in the world today, all culture, all literature and art belong to definite classes and are geared to definite political lines. There is, in fact, no such thing as art for art's sake, art that stands above classes, art that is detached from or independent of politics. Proletarian literature and art are part of the whole proletarian revolutionary cause. They are, as Lenin said, cogs and wheels in the whole revolutionary machine. So what is the purpose of art really, you bourgeois capitalists? Propaganda, it's a tool. It's a tool for revolution. That's the only function of art, according to Mao, right? Here's a little more recent spin on the function of art from President Xi Jinping of China. And it drives me crazy. Journalists, half of them say President Xi for some reason. It is President Xi, like Xi drives me crazy. So yeah, President Xi, that drives me crazy. President Xi. Fine artworks should be like sunshine from blue sky and breeze and spring that will inspire minds, warm hearts, cultivate tastes, and this is President Xi, so there's a little paternalism in here, and clean up undesirable work styles. Art has a lot to do. So if art, as you all have pointed to, if art is just propaganda, according to Mao, let's think about propaganda, right? I think when we think of American propaganda, we might first think of posters from the World Wars, or WPA posters from the Depression era. There's a couple of great examples here. I Want You for U.S. Army, Rosie the Riveter, etc. I probably should have provided a trigger warning. I'm sorry for this one, but those early posters seem very tame and naive today by the modern standards of political campaign propaganda, much of which is negative, frankly. That's what we're dealing with today. And I'm sorry, folks, but steel yourselves for next year because we're in for another round of all this stuff. But let me throw this out to you all again. What is propaganda? What is propaganda? Something for the cause. Something for the cause, yeah. So it's a message, a clear message that's supposed to convince somebody else. Good. So that kind of. So brainwashing, and that means that it really provides like one perspective, right? Unequivocal perspective. This is the truth, and there's no gray, right? Other aspects. Excellent. So the idea of using emotion to convince people of things, that's really important. What else? Any other aspects of propaganda? I think you guys have touched on a lot of the important elements. I pulled out a couple of these from readings. So it's aimed at a broad audience, typically, not always, but typically, promotes a specific ideology, as you said, a specific idea. One thing it does is consolidate authority, right? It's coming from a particular source, and therefore, it's trying to bring you to respect that source. It's designed to inspire action of some sort, right? Do something, right? Has a clear, accessible message, and as you mentioned, it plays on emotion, right? These are some of the characteristics of propaganda. So let's turn to propaganda in China. Certainly, there's a long history of art made for political purposes in imperial China, and Jill mentioned my dissertation was about the use of religion in 18th century imperial art. But political art made for public consumption was a relatively new idea in China in the 20th century. The ideology of art for public propaganda was introduced from the Soviet Union in a style called Soviet Socialist Realism. Russian artists were sent to China, Chinese artists were sent to Moscow, and Chinese painters learned the style. Why is it called realism? Well, it's the subject matter. It's not the style of painting, but it's the subject matter that's real, right? Images of workers, farmers, everyday people, right? Real people that were part of the revolution. It's also historical subjects, historical scenes from the revolution, or of course, the cult of personality, right? We see an image of Joseph Stalin down there on the left at a happy moment when he wasn't killing millions of people. What about style? So the style of Soviet socialist realism was mostly a kind of idealized naturalism, as you see in these images, with a little touch of post-impressionist kind of abstraction, as the art folks I think can recognize. But sometimes that leans into a more gritty naturalism in images of laborers, as you see in the upper right, or in this Chinese image, soldiers, like this example by the military painter He Kongde, of soldiers of the Chinese Expeditionary Force during the Korean War. The artist was there as a soldier and part of the propaganda art department, and this is one of the most kind of recognized, very, successful images of socialist realism from that period. It dates to 1963. And interestingly enough, the image that we have in the show, it's a gouache painting that was sort of a preparatory painting for a poster that was never made. So really rare, and we're really lucky to have it. But it was from that same subject matter, right? It's probably a little bit later than He Kongde's painting, but it's an image of a volunteer, People's Volunteer Army soldier who served in North Korea from 1950 to 1950. So that's the subject of this painting. You can see the uniforms are almost identical. And our painting by Shen Jiawei that's on view, and it's really going to be the focus of this talk a little bit later, is another one of these paintings. Now, these paintings oil on canvas, these were made for exhibition. They were made for museums. They weren't always turned into posters. A lot of times they were considered, if there's a distinction between fine art and art for public dissemination, these paintings were made for museums and special exhibitions. We'll come back to that painting. By far the most common way that socialist realist art was disseminated was through mass-produced posters that were visible most often in public spaces, but many people, liked them, took them home, put them up at home as kind of a decoration. I love this image from 1953. So the period when China and the Soviet Union were close, the time when artists were coming to China and going to Moscow to study. This one is entitled "Study the Advanced Production Experience of the Soviet Union: Struggle for the Industrialization of Our Country." It shows a Russian guy looking off into the distance with a Chinese engineer with him with a blueprint as if he's learning from him. Of course, that elder brother thing got old in China and led to the Sino-Soviet split in the 50s and 60s, but that comes a little bit later. So the posters of the 50s and 60s in China, to me at least, are reminiscent of earlier US 20th century propaganda posters, like the WPA posters, images of industry, like we see here. The one on the left is not a WPA image, it's a little bit earlier, but same style that I think we think of. This one from 1943, work on a farm this summer. On the right, the inscription reads, "The vegetables are green, the pumpkin's big, the harvest is bountiful," 1959. So promoting this idea of reconstructing China, either through industry or through agriculture. But all of the arts were affected by the Cultural Revolution as they were transformed into tools to support the specific concerns and ideals of that movement. So not everybody, knows about the Cultural Revolution. So give me a minute here, give you some background. The Cultural Revolution, from 66 to 76 are the dates usually given for it. 76 is the death of Chairman Mao, was a period of great violence and social upheaval in China. After the deaths of tens of millions in the famines that resulted from Mao's disastrous policies during the Great Leap Forward, Mao was eased out of power by reformers like Deng Xiaoping and others who came back later. He regained his political dominance by appealing to the idealism of the youth and going, around the government and going directly to the youth, to young people, and encouraging them to rise up and to continue the revolution. And many young people, let's be compassionate for a moment here. They were raised in an era of fear and instability, and they found an identity and a mission in Mao's message, right? Cutting through all of the chaos in a sense, and taking this as their life mission. Schools were closed, and many students joined gangs of what were called the Red Guards, paramilitary groups who overthrew traditional culture by destroying and looting religious and historical sites and persecuting Mao's perceived enemies and sparking widespread massacres. Estimates of deaths in the period are a little bit fuzzy, but they range from the hundreds of thousands to perhaps even the millions. However, today, the legacy of this period is complicated. It's remembered as a time of chaos, death, and destruction by those who were its targets, like the gentleman on the left there. Many experienced harassment, imprisonment, torture, hard labor, seizure of property, sometimes execution. People like Liu Haisu, the painter who's on view in the show. However, for some people who were young at the time, there are nostalgic memories of freedom and excitement. For people in rural areas, there was an expansion of agricultural research and building of infrastructure. The government, however, while acknowledging the destruction of this period, suppresses discussion of it in public contexts like museums and whatnot, or in academia. If anything, during the Cultural Revolution, the art became more idealized, more abstract, with a greater focus on political ideology and current political campaigns. In many paintings, posters, and murals of the era, a kind of holy trinity appears, most often a worker, a farmer, and a soldier. Sometimes the farmer, as in our painting, was replaced by a student, or in this case, a barefoot doctor. So these were young women that were trained in basic medical skills and were sent out to the countryside that was underserved with few doctors and few nurses. In this case, the title criticized the slogan, "Practice self-control and restore civility." That's a bit to unpack there. The slogan, "Practice self-control and restore civility," was propagated by anti-Mao forces who wanted to end the violence and destruction of the Cultural Revolution. So this poster that says "criticize that" was something that was criticizing that effort toward peace, which was perceived as counter-revolutionary. Although probably never realized as a poster, this painting serves as an excellent example of the mass criticism posters that were widespread during the period, and even in China, very few of these survive. The pamphlet that the man is the industrial worker is grabbing in his left hand, if you look closely at it, it actually says, "Criticize Lin, criticize Confucius." What is that all about? Well, we've got another poster devoted to that. This was another mass criticism campaign, the Criticize Lin Biao and Confucius campaign. The campaign was part of Mao's strategy to regain political power after being eased out by people like Deng Xiaoping and Lin Biao. Lin was his designated successor, who died in a mysterious plane crash. Propaganda posters were a major part of this campaign. This poster on view in the exhibition has all the characteristics that we've talked about in relation to propaganda, but it also engages the past on a number of levels. Not only the reference to Confucius, but in its style, the rough style of the lines and simple color scheme recall early communist posters of the 1930s at the beginning of the communist movement in China, made by the modern woodcut movement. It's a wonderful example called China War, one of the most famous of those images. So again, we see the holy trinity of a soldier, a worker, and a student shown against the backdrop of a big public rally. The trio symbolically attack Lin Biao and Confucius, the little figures that are being sort of stabbed out in the lower corner, associating Lin Biao with discredited traditional thought and culture as represented by the ancient philosopher Confucius. A clever dig at Confucius is also seen in the Chinese text that refers to Confucius as Kong Lao Er, which means the second eldest son of the Kong family, but in Beijing slang also means penis. So in a way, in the earthy rhetoric of the period, they're saying, you know, that dickhead Confucius. You'll excuse my. Perhaps the most influential figure in the arts during the Cultural Revolution was Mao's wife, Jiang Qing. Her guidelines for the arts include ideals like these. Theatricality. She had been an actress before she joined the revolution and you know, got together with Mao. I think she was his third wife. So theatricality is a big part of images of this era. Rejection of Western style. So what we saw in the paintings, like you know, the snowy mountains that we saw a moment ago, rejected, seen as too Western. Let's go back to Chinese styles, and that includes things like bold outlines and primary colors and de-emphasis on shading. All these things were part of traditional Chinese art. The idea of making everyone red, bright, and shining. That was one of her ideals that was propagated at the time. In fact, the REM song "Shiny Happy People," has anybody heard of that? Apparently was inspired. Michael Stipe in an interview said it was inspired by some of this art. And most important for the next part of our talk, she wanted art from previously disenfranchised social strata and regions to be elevated. And that brings us to our next topic. One of those previously disenfranchised areas was rural Shanxi province. Huxian is the name of a village in rural Shanxi, today known as Huyi District, near the capital of Xi'an, the ancient capital. And in the 1960s, the arts were seen as a useful part of the continuing efforts to create a new China on socialist models. And professional painters were sent out to rural areas like Shanxi to educate farmers in painting techniques and approve subjects. As has happened in other times and places in the world, let's say, you know, Florence, an unusual interplay of conditions, motivations, and individuals came together to make Huxian, this town, a particular center for art production. It just exploded, an amazing creativity. A group of these painters became known as the Huxian peasant painters, an unfortunate translation. As farmers, the painters were themselves seen as representatives of a new art that was rooted in folk traditions and free of the elitist associations of painting in earlier eras. In reality, they initially received extensive training and assistance from professional painters when the central government began to promote their work. The paintings were largely done in gouache on paper. Many works by these artists were reproduced and widely distributed as posters, and a number of Huxian paintings have become canonical works in art history textbooks. I remember studying a few back in the day. We at the Allen were lucky enough to be able to acquire these two examples in an auction last month. And this is their debut at the Allen. I look forward to bringing them out sometime soon. Let me tell you a little bit about them because they're amazing. This is by the artist Liu Fang. I haven't been able to find very much information about her, apart from the information that's written on the back of the painting, which identifies her as a young woman, 18 years old, in June 1973 when she did this painting. Let's talk about the subject a little bit. It shows a group of young people and one older man gathered in a cotton field. There was a lot of attention paid to sort of scientific cultivation and making hybrids and things like that. So I think they're studying the crops as part of one of those things. A few of them have notebooks and pencils, right? And others are closely examining the plants. However, the beauty of the scene and the happy facial expressions of all the people, the shiny, happy people, give the impression that it is as much a social event as it is a work outing for this group. Now, I suspect that the young people may represent sent down or rusticated youth. These were urban secondary school students, or quote unquote intellectual youths that were sent to rural communities during the Cultural Revolution to learn from the farmers, such as the older man, second from the right, who seems older than the other people. Despite a general sense of naivete in the technique, the painting demonstrates a sophisticated artistic vision in the composition and the color scheme. The viewer is slightly elevated, giving us an overview of the setting, subtle diagonals in the line of figures, and the break between the cotton field and the sunflower field in the background energize an otherwise tranquil scene. And the serene green cotton field that fills the composition is also enlivened, I think, by the colorful clothing. So there's really a lot of complexity here. The next painting is by the artist Liu Jigui, who was actually one of the most famous of the Huxian painters. He was born in Huxian in 1945. In 1962, he joined the peasant painting group and studied painting in his spare time, eventually becoming an art teacher in a school, and then later became an art administrator in his later career, for the rest of his career. In this painting, A Sleepless Night, a woman studies late at night while her young daughter sleeps beside her. The handles of agricultural tools and a sun hat are in the foreground on the left, suggesting that she's a farmer by day. But the books by Mao, Marx, and Engels on the windowsill behind her point to her education and dedication to socialist thought, as do the awards on the wall to the rear. These certificates attest to her study and probably reflect her submission of essays like the one that she is writing, which is titled Severely Criticize, again, severely criticize the fallacy that men are superior to women. The state, that's right, the woman is smart. Sorry, little Harry Belafonte just passed away. I had to do that. The statement is found in the classic text, the I Ching, traditionally attributed to Confucius. And, again, Confucius, right? And the topic is probably suggested, the use selecting it as a topic is probably suggested by the criticized Lin Biao and Confucius campaign I mentioned, which is actually on the poster on the building in the shadows out in the distance. If you read it carefully, it says, criticize Lin Biao and Confucius. Other details supporting the general theme of the painting include a poster from the revolutionary opera Azalea Mountain that was commissioned by Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, and it's an image of the heroine of the story. And then this very cute image of the young daughter, the sleeping daughter, next to a toy fighter jet, right? So not a doll, a fighter jet, which suggests the new opportunities for women in China. And on top of those paintings, we were extremely lucky to find one of the posters made from the painting, and have also added that to the collection. We're able to show the poster for classes and hopefully on the sometimes. So we're kind of starting to wind it up here. So what is propaganda, right? We've talked about broad audience, promote ideology, consolidated authority, inspire action, clear accessible message, plays on emotions, all of those things. So let's revisit the question, what is propaganda? Is this propaganda? What do you think? Is it an inspiring action? What action is it inspiring? Buy some Chanel, right? Go out there, get that bag, and you'll be as sexy as Mila Jovovich, right? Is a clear, accessible message? I think. Plays on emotion. Lust is an emotion. Consolidate authority. Maybe Chanel's an authority, right? Yeah. What about, certainly Wang Guangyi, who's also on View, thinks that this is, Chanel advertisement is an example of propaganda. That's another lecture. What about this one? Probably our most famous painting. Go for it. Good. So just to repeat what was said, it's encouraging kind of martyrdom, right? Self-sacrifice for the religion, in this case, Christianity, Catholicism. Any other political messages? I'm kind of out ahead of my skis in this group. I think people know this painting a lot better than I do, but what was going on in Utrecht in, what was this, 1620 or 1625? What might be some of the political significances of this painting? Yeah. So the Counter-Reformation, right? Because it's a Catholic subject, right? And Utrecht was like 40% Catholic, unlike the rest of the northern Dutch provinces. Yeah. So clearly we could do that. We could do the political analysis. We could do the religious context. We could do all of that. But let's get away from that for a moment. Let's hold the idea of propaganda in suspense, and let's look at the painting as a painting. And to do that, how many of you guys are familiar with the Great Courses series? My mother-in-law turned me on to these. We listen to a lot of them. They started as DVDs, and now they're all on videos. But Professor William Klaas, who is an Oberlin College graduate, 1964, is one of the great course instructors, carefully selected among all the professors in America. And this painting appears in a series called The World's Greatest Paintings. It is a little bit Eurocentric, but they are the world's greatest paintings. And he talks very briefly, about a minute or so, he talks about this painting. Let's listen.
The grouping of hands in that corner is remarkable and unforgettable. Two strong, vital, determined hands flanking a hand that has turned gray, nearly black. We reach that agonizing place through the long, stretched diagonal of his arm that begins really with his left leg, and through the compact alignment of heads. One head pale and hanging in shadow, one in full light facing forward, and one in half-shadowed profile, fully focused on her hands warm with lifeblood, and his hand cold, bloodless, lifeless. Irene's devoted servant has wrapped a length of the cord around her own left hand, and it presses into her resilient flesh, while with her right hand she carefully works to release Sebastian's wrist from bonds that have cut deeply into his inanimate flesh, stemming the flow of blood, leaving his hand curled and black, as shriveled as a dead flower. Rarely has the most telling moment in a painting been relegated to a corner, and it is above these hands and the life-death struggle that Terbruggen has chosen to sign and date his hand's work on the tree trunk. Sebastian's right leg begins a shorter diagonal parallel to the first that leads us to the arrow that Irene starts to extract from the wound. In fact, the three arrows are placed to echo the main axes of the composition, paralleling his torso as well as his arm, forming a large X that controls the group and the picture plane.
So what Professor Klaas has provided for us there is a wonderful example of formal analysis, right? That's one of the most important tools in the toolkit of art historians, being able to describe and analyze why a painting works visually, right? And I think that's a great example of it. And that is what I want to do to apply to the painting on the left, climbing over the Great Snow Mountains. Some of you may know the subject matter. We'll get to the subject matter in a moment. Let's just look at it as a painting to begin with. Right? So let's start with the general composition. Anybody out there, how would you describe the way the artist has composed the figures on the picture plan? There are some clear diagonals, aren't there, right? The grouping right through the middle. And there's another diagonal from the cloak, right? It's being blown by the wind, right? So kind of like we just saw with the Terbruggen painting of St. Sebastian, intersecting diagonals. Other things that you see. Go. Yeah, please. Good. So in a sense, all of our attention is focused on those figures, right? There's some snow in the foreground, there's some mist in the background. In fact, let's start down here, right? What do we see happening at the bottom of the painting? So snow blowing, trudging, right? People trudging through the snow. Deep snow, right? You can't even see their boots, right? And then up here, what are some of the elements that we see? Yeah, Tom. You get this struggling against the wind. You get the sense of just brutal conditions that they're dealing with, right? Snow, wind, exhaustion, probably, right? There's an injured man on a horse. There's a young fellow holding onto his hat, and the man in the foreground is physically dragging him forward, right, and holding onto the horse, the reins of the horse, right? Other things. Little dots of red, like the star and the flag in the background in the front. Yeah. The next generation of the revolution, right? Dragging them forward into the future. Yeah. All of those. So I think you've done a great job in breaking it down visually. Is it an effective painting? Is it possible to get beyond the political subject matter? Does it have a universal appeal? What do you think? To do that? Yeah. So let's turn now in our last couple of minutes here and talk and give you some of that background, give you some of that historical context that we're ignoring briefly as we did our formal analysis, right? Chen Jiawei was born to a working class family in Shanghai about a year before the People's Republic was founded in 1949. He taught himself how to paint and was assigned to make political propaganda images by his work unit during the Cultural Revolution. His 1974 painting, Standing Guard for Our Great Motherland, probably his most famous painting, won praise from Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, who we talked about a little bit earlier, was reproduced in thousands of posters. After the Cultural Revolution in the early 1980s, Shen finally received formal artistic training at the Central Academy of Fine Arts in Beijing, and he left China in 1989, moved to Australia, where he continues to work today. He painted a portrait of Pope Benedict a few years ago. So he's getting some gigs, right? About a decade after moving to Australia, Shun made some of his paintings available on the art market, and with a connection provided by Professor Julia Andrews from Ohio State and Kuei Shun from UC San Diego, the Allen was able to acquire both the painting and the preparatory drawings and color studies for it, with grant support from the Carpenter Foundation. All of them are on view in the exhibition. Please take a look after the talk. But what is the specific subject of the painting? So the figure in the center, who's clearly the hero of the story, right, is Joan L. And he is leading troops during the Long March. So what was the Long March? In 1934, the army of the Chinese nationalist government, led by General Chiang Kai-shek, began a vigorous campaign to exterminate the Chinese Communist Red Army, led by Mao and others. And outnumbered and nearly surrounded, the Red Army made a daring escape by marching an estimated 5,600 miles from Jiangxi province to Shanxi province, where Huxian is located, through some of the most difficult terrain in China. The Long March, as it came to be known, took more than a year to complete, and only approximately 8,000 of the original 100,000 soldiers survived. However, it allowed the Chinese Communist forces to regroup and to eventually emerge victorious in their struggle to control China. The memory of the Long March was often invoked by the communist government during the tumultuous 60s and 70s to remind people of the party's earlier sacrifices and to encourage an ongoing spirit of endurance and loyalty to the state. So Zhou Enlai was Mao's #2 guy. He was actually tapped to take over after Mao, after a couple of other guys had been eliminated. But but he died in January 8th, 1976. And, Mao has a complicated, troubled legacy for a lot of reasons, but Zhou has a much more positive reputation in modern Chinese history. And after his death, Mao was still basically in charge and didn't allow a lot of mourning. He didn't allow public mourning of Zhou. And the people revolted against that. It started in Nanjing in March. There was a movement to commemorate Joan L and oppose the Cultural Revolution, the excesses of the Cultural Revolution. That was followed at Tiananmen Square, the famous big square in Beijing, April 4th and 5th, during what's called the Qingming Festival, which is a festival where you remember the dead, right, in China. It's a traditional time to do that. And thousands of people showed up at Tiananmen. Over 2,000 wreaths were laid in Tiananmen Square, memorializing the death of Zhou. Over 100,000 people showed up when they were removed by the government. Right? So this was, this is the kind of thing that the government of China is deeply afraid of, right? These big public uprisings. But this event was the beginning of the end for the Gang of Four, who you probably heard of, Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, was part of the Gang of Four, really running things during the Cultural Revolution, and also pointed to the end of the Cultural Revolution and the subsequent rise of Deng Xiaoping. So we've had a chance to look at this painting from a couple of different perspectives. We looked at it from a formal analysis perspective. Is it effective as a painting? Is it effective as a work of propaganda? What's the subject matter? What's the historical context, right? So the theme of this talk, only cogs and wheels, what I hope I've done here is to provide, a little bit more background. I think it's easy to dismiss Cultural Revolution propaganda images as kind of cartoony, right? They seem so obvious in their political messages and their propagandistic intent. But, think about how you would have viewed them if you had been there at that time, right? You know all the subtleties of what's happening, and you're being shown these images, and I think people would have had very different reactions to them, obviously depending on, their background. Anyway, that's all we have time for.